Hello. Okay, it looks like we are live and we are here, and I am excited to be able to welcome everyone here to our panel entitled "Emerging at Any Stage." And to begin, I would like to first acknowledge our First Nations, First Storytellers, and the traditional owners of the land we are broadcasting from. The Wurundjeri people, the Burung people of the Kulin Nation, as well as the Whadjuk Noongar peoples. We acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to the First Nations people watching, and the elders of this land in which this recording might reach. We acknowledge and respect their cultural heritage, their beliefs, and the continued relationship to this unceded lands, its waters, the communities, and that these connections are sustained through oral traditions containing knowledge that should be centered. And in this acknowledgement of country, I would like to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. Our First Nations people matter. And it's my pleasure also to introduce this amazing panel. And so we'll start with Sandi. Sandi Parsons lives and breathes stories. And as a reader, writer, and storyteller, having spent 19 years working in educational libraries, she is a passionate, she's very passionate about diversity and storytelling and engaging in readers with stories. Sandi considers herself a guardian, has that guardianship of gifted lungs, one of her many victories in her ongoing battle with cystic fibrosis. And she believes that a teetering stack of books waiting to be read is an essential component of every household. Similarly, we've got Gabriel Garcia Ochoa. And he was born in Mexico City, and he lives here now in Australia for the past 15 years. He's a writer, an academic, and a professional translator. Gabriel lectures in global studies, translation, and comparative literature at Monash University. He studied at Harvard University's Institute of World Literature, where his research focused on the works of Jorge Luis Borges, and his first novel is entitled Hypermarket. And then finally, myself, I'm Dr. Denise Chapman, and I'm a passionate storyteller, digital media creator, and spoken word artist who teaches children's literature, early literacy, and new media technology at Monash University as well. I use poetry, oral stories, children's literature, film, call and response, storytelling, and interactive digital content as windows and spaces for critical activism. And my creative art and research that I'm doing really centers the experiences of oppressed and peoples and illuminates those inequities to put forward social change. So, goodness, that's a lot of talking. But let me at least tell you what the structure of the session is going to go like, so that for those of you who are out there listening to us know where we're going to be going. So first, we're going to unpack some of the concepts that revolve around the title of this panel. We'll be sharing our thoughts about being a writer and creatives. And we'll then dive into some small snippets of our work if we have enough time, and then wrap things up beautifully with questions from the audience, which you are welcome to give us questions through hashtag EWF F20 on Twitter, or YouTube, the YouTube chat if you're joining us via YouTube. So let's begin. Oh my goodness. Let's dive in and unpack the title, y'all. Gabriel, Sandi, let's unpack this title of this panel discussion and look at the term emergent writer. And it's a complex one. What are your thoughts about this term? How can we deconstruct this term?
I suppose the myth, Denise, would be that anyone thinks that someone who has emerged on the writing scene is just an overnight success, and that simply doesn't happen. There's years of work that go into writing before anything is published.
Echoing Sandi's words, it's interesting because when by the time we get published, we've usually been writing for a while. I've been writing all my life, and I love it, and it's part of who I am, and but it's almost like you emerge when people start to notice that you've been writing. It's not so much that you've just started writing; it's that people start to notice that you're writing. So it's an interesting concept. Can I preface that by saying thank you for your lovely introduction, Denise, and thank you so much to the Emerging Writer Festival for having us here. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor. So thank you so much for that lovely introduction.
Oh, thank you,
Denise. And I'm so glad that someone has noticed we're writing.
You're here.
You know, and I have to say, I feel the same way. I don't know. I'm troubled by this concept of emerging, because, you know, next year I'll be 50, and I feel like I don't know. What does this emerging mean? And haven't I always been a writer? And what does writing even mean? Is that only when it's in alphabetic text? That when it's a hard copy book, is that when you're a writer? And is it when, as you and Sandi and Gabriel were talking about, is it instead when someone finally discovers that, ooh, you're actually writing? I don't know. And for me, a lot of my stuff has been online, and or even live performances. So in some ways, I feel like, almost the baby of the group here, because each of you has tangibles, and I'm still getting started on that.
Well, this reminds me a lot of something that Edmund White writes about, the American author. He in one of his memoirs, he I think it's in A Boy's Own Story, where he says that before he got published, and he got published pretty late in life, if I'm not mistaken, he felt like he hadn't been born. And I think there's something about the publishing industry. I mean, the fact that we associate writing with being published, clearly, right? You may be writing, and the fact that you haven't been published doesn't stop you from writing, but there is this association between almost validity or being legitimized by being published. So I can relate to that. I can relate to that sensation of, I haven't cracked the shell yet because I haven't been published when I hadn't been published. So maybe that's what we associate with emergence, the fact that you're, in a sense, born into the publishing industry. I don't know.
Sandi, what are your thoughts? That was beautiful. I love that whenever we can...
Edmund White, not me, Edmund White.
Still, we're weaving it into this space, I'm a quilter, so I feel like, when we're weaving these thoughts in, we're connecting with people, we're connecting our thoughts with the people around us, the people that we read, and our ancestors as well, that really breathe life into us as and sharing stories, etc., and guiding us. What do you think, Sandi?
I think I've heard this once, and I think it's kind of true as well, that everyone writes in some sort of sense. So that term writer encompasses a lot. And the publication is when you become an author. And that publication doesn't have to be in print copy. It's whenever someone publishes your work, you move from this writing to being an author. And that gives a little bit of validity to what you're doing. So, I haven't just been sitting there hanging about on Facebook. I've actually been doing something on that time that I've been banging around on the keyboard.
Well, and I think each of us
Although,
probably
there might be a little bit of playing on Facebook too, but.
Oh.
Sorry, Denise. I think Sandi has a really good point. So much of the stuff, the literature that we consume, is online. That the idea of limiting being published to a physical book, I think, no longer applies. That's not the world we live in any longer. But I was born a couple of decades ago, and I still have a very strong relationship to physical books, and I can't avoid that.
I think there's a slightly different feeling too when being able to hold something, whether it be a magazine or an anthology or a book that is in print, as opposed to just, oh, look, my stuff's online, it's been published, as having this physical thing you can hold.
It's really powerful. And, if I can say that one of the things that I'd like to also unpack and to share it through some questions here are really just talking about ourselves here, this collective, this emerging at any stage squad team. What, and also given the fact that becoming a writer at any age or stage in one's professional career, that there seems to be this balancing act that goes on. And I was wondering, how do you all juggle working and writing at the same time?
So I'll jump in then. So for me, it was slightly different. Because I wrote my first book just before I went into respiratory failure. So I was juggling writing, I was juggling the fact that I was possibly going to die, and work. So I consider that time that I was hobby writing, I was giving it a test run, and I was flapping about not knowing what I really wanted to do. And when I was in respiratory failure on the transplant list, I had a lot of time to think. And I knew that my book was still going to be published. I might not be there to see it published, but I was going to be published. And that was my bucket list. And I decided there that I'd flapped about with the hobby writing for too long, and that if I got these new lungs, I was going to get serious about it. So I started doing courses once I was in recovery, and I became serious about it. So I started devoting time to it. And I think that was the difference, flapping to being serious, for me anyway.
Gabriel,
that's a really moving story. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's really, really moving. I think I learned how to juggle writing with work when I was writing my PhD. My PhD was in creative writing. And I think one of the most important things I learned from my PhD was how I function, what works for me in terms of my writing. And I discovered throughout that process that I write in the morning, and I write very well in the morning. So I wake up early. I'm a morning person. And I write at least for 1 hour, if I can 2 hours in the morning. And that's the most important part of my day done. Whatever happens next after those 2 hours, I know that my writing is done. And then comes work, and then come all my other commitments, but my writing is done. And that gives me I don't know, it's, without wanting to sound corny, it's almost like a spiritual thing for me. That's the time that is for myself, for something that is very important to me, and it's almost sacred. So I have those hours, and then whatever comes after that I can deal with to a greater or lesser extent, but I've got those hours.
Yes. I have to say that each of you, I feel like I'm really learning from this space and how people are juggling. And I think each of us is so different. And I've come to writing, and I really never saw myself as a writer. In fact, I which seems strange for someone who works in academia. But I think my my background as a person of peoples who are living on the margins, as an African American, I never really felt myself as feeling like I was good enough to be able to be heard. That my message, that space. And so I share that because in terms of being able to do that juggling act, I just thought, well, there's nothing really to juggle. I just am not. And I think it wasn't until quite recently that I went and I thought, or at least had really some challenges with my transition here to Australia, my transition in so many ways in life. And so I ended up going towards writing poetry to really make sense of what was going on, what was happening to me, but also to leave something for my children, leave something behind for them, because I felt like I couldn't understand what was happening, and I felt like I was drowning. I really did. And so that's how I've come to writing. But I'm curious for each of us, and I kind of touched on, I guess, some aspects of sort of what inspiration, and I'm wondering, did you always see yourselves as writers, Gabriel and Sandi, and how did you get inspired to become a writer? Can I start with Sandi first? Yeah,
of course.
So for me, Denise, I guess it was growing up disabled. I was different to the other kids, and I had a lot of treatments to do, and they weren't fun treatments, and they were very time consuming and very boring. So books were my friends, and they gave me so much that and I think maybe year 4, year 5, around there, I realised, hey, there's a name on the bottom of this. Someone actually wrote it. Yeah. And it was a conscious decision then that I was going to write to give back, because reading had given me so much. I wanted to give back so that someone else could fall in love with stories. And there was no burning desire to tell a story. It was just this concept of one day I am going to be a writer. And that just stuck through the whole way through. So lots of flapping and lots of hobby writing, but it was always one day I am going to be a writer.
Oh, that touches my heart, because I was just my daughter's just recently had a huge birthday party. Not huge birthday party because we're in ISO, but small. A few kids came over, so each of them had 5 children that they invited over, and with my youngest daughter, she had one of the little girls had come up, and she came into our space here and said, "Oh, the books you have are so beautiful." And then she said, "One day I want to become a writer." And she said, "You write poetry. Does it make you feel good when you do it?" And I was like, "Yeah, sometimes it makes me sad. But then once I've got it out there, then I feel really good." And she's like, "I want to write about bullying, because," and I just thought, oh, so it's really beautiful when you see someone so young thinking that way. Gabriel, what about yourself? I just interjected right in there, didn't I?
That is the best possible segue. I can't believe you brought that up. I think books and music saved my life as a child and an adolescent. I was bullied systematically for many years at school, and I remember when I escaped my bullies at school, I would do so by going into the library. And stepping into the library had for me a sense of awe that I assume is what religious people feel when they enter a church. There was this sense of calm and beauty and peace, and the escapism that books provided for me was a way to rally up and recover and have some mental space so that I could heal from what was going on at school, at home, And that really gave me a haven of sanity, both books and music. And I think very much like Sandi, if I can pay that back, if I can provide that to someone else through my writing, I think that's the best I can do with my life. If I can pay that back, I'll bring something good into the world. I don't know whether my writing ever does that, but that is certainly my goal. I hope that I can do that at some point.
I love this idea of paying it back, paying it forward, because I think I try to think for myself, future, thinking of the future, and maybe it's about, for me, that inspiration is get this out there, that it's almost a guidebook for my kids, that, and it's really personal. It's really, really personal. I worry about my children getting to, because there are things that I think in my family that just weren't spoken about. And so a lot of the things that I write are about things that are those hidden things, those things that we don't, I don't know. It goes with that trope of the strong Black woman, and that archetype, and so we just didn't talk about it. My mother didn't talk about those things. My grandmother didn't, and I feel that through stories we can learn so much. It embodies so much, and that's what I'm trying to pass on for my kids. But I'm curious about our creative work as a collection here, as emerging at any stage here, and for those who may not be familiar with your work, could you give us a sense of your creative work in terms of describing it? I don't know, maybe Gabriel, could you give us a sense of your creative work, and how would you describe it?
Yeah, certainly. I find I always struggle with that. I think I write fantasy and science fiction. If I find myself at uni, I'll say that I write magical realism. No, but there's a lot of fantasy in what I do. I love magical realism. So my PhD was on Borges, and I read Latin American fiction, magical realism specifically, for many years, and I adore it. And there's a lot of that in what I write. So that's how I would describe myself: predominantly fantasy, sci-fi, sometimes magical realism.
Powerful. I feel I want to dive in now. Sandi, I had the pleasure. I was like, immediately when I found out that we were all on the panel, I was trying to get everybody's books, and I was like, I'm gonna download Sandi's. This one's on a Kindle, and Sandi, how would we describe your work, because you've got a good body of it? Yes.
Yeah, it's a bit eclectic. So I go from my very highbrow stuff, where I write memoir about living with cystic fibrosis and having a transplant, and written quite a few pieces about how important it was to me to give my donor her name back, because she's the hero of my story and I'm not allowed to know her name. So I've written about that a bit. And then from my highbrow, I'm also trying to write some own voices stuff. So I have an own voices short story. And then we descend into my childish side, which I write about problem puppies, and now I'm starting to write about boogers. So from the highbrow to the lowbrow, I'm a little bit of everything.
Well, Sandi, as an early childhood educator, early childhood primary person, and I'm some of the topics that you're talking about, puppies and boogers, those are big time things. Okay.
They are.
So, I love that we've all, in terms of looking at us collectively and how we describe our work. I know for myself, I have to go back to Audre Lorde and just say and think about what she said, about poetry, and that it's the most subversive use of language that there is, because it attempts to bring about change by altering people's feelings. And that's really what, for me, how I would describe what I'm doing is not just poetry, but it's altering people's feelings and being subversive in many ways. And that I hope that my collective ends up being able to make a difference in shifting how my children and other people that are in my context as and my edgy intersections of Black female immigrant. And I think from America, that in of itself is quite sometimes feeling quite edgy. But we were just touching on things having to do with when we were growing up, or things that inspired us and young folks. And I'm just wondering, what were your favorite books as a child, or even as a young adult, that you'd like to share? I think I'm curious. Sandi, if you want to start, I'm trying to rotate. I'm trying to be fair.
So I do remember very early on, maybe being about 4 or 5, carting a copy of the movie version of Dot and the Kangaroo around. And then I just read and read and read. So, Enid Blyton, a lot of horse books, Silver Brumby, Black Stallion, Trixie Belden, Nancy Drew. But I suppose the book that impacted me the most, and I still have my copy that I got from my Scholastic magazine, and it's Robin's book. And I saw it in the Scholastic catalogue when I was in Year 9. And it was the first time I'd ever found cystic fibrosis mentioned in literature. And this is part diary and part fiction from a girl who had cystic fibrosis. And she writes about her life with cystic fibrosis, and it was interspaced with her short stories. And as you can see, I still have it. And this is my book that I've kept with me ever since.
I love that, first of all, and I almost interrupted you. So sorry. My nonverbals go, ooh, but it was more like, she's got the power to grab that right off the shelf. She's like, I know where it is, and bam, there it is. But also in your nonverbals and this breathing in of that book, that it brings the sense of life to your very being of
this was the first time I read Someone Like Me. So yes, there were books about children who are only children, and there were fantasy books, but this was the first time I read about a book written by someone who had cystic fibrosis. And then obviously since then I've written a lot of very bad books that don't quite get it. But fortunately I started on that good note.
Beautiful. Gabriel, what about you? It's just such a delicious feast here. I'm just enjoying just every morsel.
Isn't it? I was thinking, so I was trying to go back to the authors that I read early on, and I've got a list of boring ones, I'd say, but I think honestly one of the things that, in terms of storying, that moved me the most as a child was when my parents would tell me stories. We had this really beautiful tradition at home when I was a child, when my parents would make up bedtime stories for me. And particularly my dad, he would just tuck me in, and he made up this character for me when I was a kid. And he would just tell me, what would you like for this character to go through tonight? And he would just come up with stories. It was the most amazing thing, and it was a beautiful experience. And my mom, when I was younger than that, when I was a toddler, my mom would perform stories for me. She had like this Mother Goose moment that she would do every week or so, and she would tell me stories. So I think my love for telling stories began there. Then I fell in love. I mean, the C.S. Lewis was just something else. The Chronicles of Narnia were very, very important to me growing up. And there's
how many cupboards did you look in the back of?
Sorry?
How many cupboards did you look in the back of?
Many, very unsuccessfully. Many, very unsuccessfully. But and I think what attracted me about those books again was the sense of escapism that I could get from them. And I think that escapism for me was going inside, thinking there is an inner world that I can go to in order, and that I have to go to in order to survive and to come back with something good to give to this world. So the ones that come to mind would be C.S. Lewis, and there was this series of books that I came across when I was about 6 or 7, the young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which were hilarious. They were great.
Oh my goodness! Well, I'm so happy that you were talking about the stories of the families. That's your family shared with you, because I'll tell you. And then Sandi started talking about, this is the book, and I feel like, okay, mine's like an amalgamation of the two. And for me, I didn't really realize what I was. My grandfather, my mother's father, who is his peoples are of the Gullah Geechee people, who are off of the coast of South Carolina, North Carolina, and they were big, great storytellers, and so it was my grandfather. When I think about him, sitting back, telling me stories, and the Gullah people speak in a way that is a blending of many West African languages merged together with 17th century English. So, but my grandfather, being as someone who migrated, or rather during the Great Migration from the South up to the North, you didn't want to sound like you were from the South because you could be taken advantage of. And so he would tell these stories in ways that were really quiet, that my grandmother wouldn't come by and say, now Moses, Mom, we don't tell them stories like, speak proper English, that we had to speak in a very specific way now. And so my grandfather would go, as he's at the checkerboard, and he'd say something like, now, don't know. And that meant, well, only the Almighty knows, don't know. And he just, and he'd get really excited. His cheekbones would just almost raise up, and he would tell me stories about why things were the way they were. And I felt like I just swirled. It was just, I was in another world. And he would tell me things, but he wouldn't tell me things. You learned it from the stories, right? And then the first book, physical book, and I've got it here, that I remember seeing as a child, that was the one that gave me, Sandi, that same oomph that you were talking about, was this one, Mildred Taylor's Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. This book, it was back when I was 9 years old, and I was one of four people, Black people, minorities in the school that I was in. And I remember taking this book from the library, and please forgive me, Sandi, because I know you are a librarian, but Sandi, I took this book. I took the book because I felt that, I checked it out and I never gave it back, because I felt that no one would treat this book as well as I would. That nobody would treat it as well as I would, because I saw on the front cover, it was me. I felt it was me, and I had to have the book. So this was my first book. And then later on, things from Nikki Giovanni really inspire me, and still do. So love Nikki Giovanni. But oh my goodness, I'm getting wrapped up, and we've got a couple of things that we want to touch on before we get to sharing our own work. And one of the things that I'd love to ask you about, and it came up earlier, Sandi, you had mentioned something about representation. Yes, and own voices, hashtag representation, hashtag own voices, hashtag diverse text, right? Or disrupt text. And I wanted to unpack that if we could, and see from each of you and our conversations that we've had before this panel, what does representation mean to you, and why is it so important in terms of your work?
I think for me, I mean, one of my core beliefs, and this is not just my writing, it's as a librarian, so I do a lot of reading to make sure that my collection is accurate, is I believe that every child has the right to see themselves accurately represented in literature. And that accurately is such a big, big term, and it is a big, big concept of cans of worms. So I'm 47 and I have yet to read a fictional account of cystic fibrosis where the person is not sick, they are not to be pitied, they're pitied, and that it focuses on the fact that they're disabled and the things that they can't do. And it's a trope. It's a trope that sells books. 5 Feet Apart probably came the closest because there was a lot of input from a girl who had cystic fibrosis. But although they got the emotions right, they got the emotions very, very right, and I can forgive a lot if the emotions are right, they got a lot of the medical details wrong. And I feel for a child, if they're reading, and this is the first time they've encountered literature that reflects them, if the details aren't accurate, there's a jarring out of the story. And suddenly this place that they thought they might belong, they don't belong like they thought they did because someone has written their life wrong. And that's why Own Voices is so important.
Yes. And we talked about how impactful stories are, you know, within our lives as writers, and to see yourself, to read yourself about yourself.
I read myself as being pitied, and that wasn't my life. I didn't feel like my life was pitiful. I thought I had a pretty awesome life.
Yes, yes. Gabriel, what about you?
It's really interesting that you bring this up, Denise. And when both you and Sandi spoke about the first time you saw yourselves reflected in literature, I realized I never had that experience as a child. And I was actually talking to my students about this last week. I was having a chat about social change and how there's been a huge positive social change, in my view, in regard to queer rights over the last 40 years. I was born in 1984 in Mexico City in the midst of the AIDS crisis. And as a gay boy growing up in that environment, it wasn't about being a pariah. It wasn't about being outside of the group. It was about being a non-entity. I did not exist. I did not exist, and neither did my story. So there wasn't a single form of representation that I could recur to. I tell my students, and I actually think it's funny, the only gay man I knew about was Elton John. And for about 15 years, I thought that Elton John and I were the only 2 gay men in the world. I know, I know it's funny, but it got to that degree. I haven't written gay characters yet. That's not something that I do, but that I haven't done yet. Sorry, it's not something that I have done yet. But seeing myself represented in literature, when I did eventually, and that was not as a child, that was much later on, it was really moving. It was really moving to say, I exist. And I remember I was at a writers' conference a few years ago in the US, and Lev Grossman, who wrote The Magicians, a trilogy that's become quite famous, he's got a couple of queer characters in his books, and they're fantasy books. And this was 2016, and I remember during a panel, someone asked him, "Why are they gay characters in your books, queer characters in your books?" And he said, "Because queer people are real, and fantasy books represent reality with magic. Queer people are real; they should be represented." And there was this roar of applause. And I think it's a matter of dignity. I think it boils down to dignity. Let's give us the dignity to be represented in our complexity and to have a space, because we're here.
But, I almost forgot that I'm in a panel. I'm not having a conversation, a coffee on Zoom time with y'all, because this is, and hearing you say, we are here, and that, I think of MLK, saying that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter to us, right? And that we need to make sure that we are represented in the complexities that we're represented, and it's there, and also it's probably one of the first things that I talk about in the children's literature is, which is why it's so powerful, is that Rudy Sims Bishop talks about books needing to be mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, and that there's, it's not just windows to be able to look at things from different perspectives. There's sliding glass doors to be able to widen our imagination, so that we don't have this imagination gap that Ebony Elizabeth Thomas talks about in The Dark Fantastic. But we need to also have mirrors for not just for ourselves, right? To be able to say, like my daughter, who decided, she said, well, I'm going to try out for Annie, the play Annie at her school. And I went, oh, okay. And she's like, and I said, so what part? She's like, the lead. And I went, even though I'm sitting here and I'm teaching folks about we need mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, I went, oh, why is that? Because, it's I have to constantly work at that, right? I got to constantly and think on that, if you will, not think just about it, but think on it. Anyway, the media that she consumed was more expansive in that she was able to see the movie that I remember as a child from the 80s, what I think it's 81, that came out with Annie, but also she also saw, the first one that she saw was the production that Will Smith had, where little, Annie looked like her. But I have that. And so it's interesting. And so representation, yes, we need those mirrors, but it's not just for people who are just like us, but everyone needs to see that. My neighbor down the street, who might not look like my daughter, needs to see that my daughter and people who look like my daughter, can be. If you don't see it, you can't be it, so to speak. But also, if you don't see it, then you don't think it's there. It can't be. Yeah. So, oh goodness, again, I'm going and I'm having too much fun. And I think we need to move on to thinking about the juiciness of diving into our own work. Could I ask us to maybe to share a little bit of our work, maybe, given just a little sampling of our work, 2-3 minutes?
Yep.
Who would jump in? All right.
So this is from The Great Ned Head Heist. It is in our own voices, and it's a manuscript that's currently under consideration. So this is about halfway through. Dara's stomach cramps, a not so subtle hint that she needs to speed things along before she faces a larger dilemma. Excuse me, Mrs. Penton, may I go to the toilet? George takes Dara's interruption as a chance to escape from Mrs. Penton and push past, nearly knocking Josh off his feet. Mrs. Penton frowns. Oh, Dara, that's not like you. I did ask everyone before we came. My stomach was fine then. I had bacon for breakfast and I don't think I took enough enzymes. There it is again, her mouth running away before she can think. So much for secrets. She may as well have a neon sign on her forehead declaring her health status. At least no one but Josh heard her, and he'll most likely think enzymes are another word game to solve. Mrs. Penton frowns, placing her hand on Dara's forehead. You're not coming down with something, are you? Miss Isaba bustles over to join them, and Josh mutters, fabulous, we moved away from Ned's armour and now we're surrounded by teacher on all sides. My breathing is fine and I'm not coughing any more than normal. Dara gives a short, sharp, extremely fake cough to emphasise her point. As far as cough rating goes, the attempt that emits from her mouth is a triple A-rated pathetic cough. But if she coughs properly, Miss Penton will most likely enter panic mode, and the last thing Dara needs is a fuss. Regardless, she sounds anxious. Getting a new teacher to understand that you know how your body works better than they do is always tricky. At the beginning of the year, teachers make the tiniest thing into a drama, worrying about every little detail in case she gets sick on their watch. In this case, having moved schools, it's worse because Mrs. Penton can't ask last year's teacher. Shall I find someone to go with you, Miss Penton asks. Dara shakes her head frantically. I'm partners with Josh. I don't want him to have to hang around waiting for me. Besides, he wants to quag-squag in front of Ned's armour. Mrs. Penton glances around and her gaze settles on Melody. Dara's eyes widen. This could easily turn into an epic disaster. Forcing Melody to stand outside the toilet door waiting for Dara will see her kiss any friendship hopes goodbye. There's only one thing worse than sitting on the loo with your stomach cramping, the knowledge that there is someone outside the loo waiting on you.
Oh. My mouth is open.
Because everyone always talks about the lung involvement and no one ever speaks about the things we should not speak about.
The loo.
And that was one of my biggest problems as a child is, where is the bathroom? And can I get it without anyone seeing me?
And there's nothing like someone waiting on you while you're in the loo. That's not exactly how you
mix up your enzymes, you're in there an awful lot.
This is just so powerful. I'm so glad that we're going to be getting the opportunity to share a sampling of our writing. And I wanted to give Gabriel a chance to be able to jump in as well and to share some of his.
Thank you so much, Denise, and thank you so much for that, Sandi. That was great. Thank you so much. This is from the first chapter of my novel, The Hypermarket, that LCG Media published, and it starts, not surprisingly, at a library. So the first chapter is called The Hypermarket. I'm going to time myself because otherwise you're going to have to do as they do at the Oscars and turn on the music. The Hypermarket. I entered the library with nothing but a pencil and the 6th volume of Sir Richard Francis Burton's The Arabian Nights. The Houghton Library at Harvard University houses an army of treasures. I visited regularly for research. It is a beautiful place, a classic example of a rare book library. Wood-paneled walls, oil paintings in the main reading room, a foyer with marble busts and a spiral staircase ascending to God knows where, but leading down to the bathrooms. Some of the documents at the Houghton are simply priceless. This particular document was not held in high regard by the library. It did not belong to any of its special collections. It had been erroneously catalogued, evidently, and some of its most fascinating features had escaped whomever had curated its entry. The monk Dondrulus of Abyssinia tells us that time is a river that flows backwards. According to him, the future is what has already happened, but our restricted point of view does not allow us to differentiate it from the past. Nietzsche, of course, talks about the eternal return, time as an ever-spinning wheel, concentric circles within the blueprint of history, playing over and over again. Claptrap, I used to say, or if one wished to show a more indulgent disposition, we might call this idea's rudimentary philosophy. At least that was my view until I came across the diary. I sat down with the volume of Burton's Nights and my pencil. It took Mary, the librarian, whom I have known for about 15 years, less than 5 minutes to find the diary and bring it to me. She placed the item on the desk, and I thought back to last Thursday when I first came across it. An unsettling feeling had taken hold of me early that morning, after hearing on the radio that the singer Otis Redding had died in an airplane crash. I was in the kitchen. The news was followed by the announcement of this year's literary Nobel, and a man by the name of Miguel Asturias. I may have read Redding's name before. Asturias I knew nothing about. But the strongest déjà vu I have ever experienced ground me to a halt as I walked from the sink to the breakfast table. The sensation, like a bad aftertaste, stayed with me all morning. I went to the Houghton that Thursday afternoon, hoping to cheer myself up. I already had a stack of other documents to get through when I came across the diary. I was about to skip it altogether, but the familiar curiosity that has driven my career gave me a shy shove in the ribs. I started leafing through and a line caught my eye. The hypermarket is big and sells almost everything. That word, hypermarket, made little sense to me, so I kept reading. And we'll leave it there. And so this is a very, very old diary, and somehow the word hypermarket has slipped in, and we don't know how come are they talking about a hypermarket if this happened a couple of centuries ago? So that's the start of the novel.
Like it.
You're salivating.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Sandi, what were you going to say?
Oh, I just loved it.
Oh, gosh.
I can't wait to read the rest of it.
Exactly. And I kept thinking about, I don't know why, for some reason, I was thinking in terms of Octavia Butler was coming up in my mind as I was thinking about this sort of, there's some aspects of the futurism sort of like state, this sense of time that you were talking about, that I don't know. All I know, Gabriel, if someone breaks into your house and takes one book, and it's that book, I don't know, it wasn't me.
Thank you. So, well, you're spot on. It's a dystopian novel, and what starts happening once we read what that diary says is that someone is talking about this future where the world has become a hypermarket. The world is like a supermarket, but gone crazy, and whole continents are the health and beauty section and stuff like that. And it's kind of capitalism just gone absolutely rampant, and that's where the story starts. But we'll leave it there.
Mm-mm. Well, now I know that I'm looking at the time, and fortunately, because I do poetry, I can chunk it up real good here. And I wanted to give a sampling of stuff. And then what we'll do is we've got some questions that have popped up, and we'll get to those questions just right after this. The first piece that I want to share, and these are recent ones that have to do with what's going on in the world. Again, those edgy intersections that I have. And this first piece is entitled Morning. And I'll try to enunciate as clearly as I can so that you can hear the shift in this. And this piece was written because, I'll read it first. Morning. I'm fearful each morning, I'm fearful. My brother's face will be looking at me, fearful, asking for help as I'm staring at my phone, fearful. Each morning, I'm fearful. And that was, for me, each morning I wake up, the first thing I touch is my iPhone, thinking, is my brothers, are they going to be on a video that's been captured online? And so I feel the sense of mourning being mourning, a mourning of someone's life. This next one is called Little Hands. Little hands. My youngest daughter's little hands hugged me today. That feeling muted the chaos, shooed way dim hates, reminded me of my purpose. I am activated. And so this is, after each morning, I feel that I'm, every now and then my kids catch me crying and tearful because of some of the things that are going on. And this very last one is for George Floyd, and it's called Our Brother. And you'll hear me sort of shift into words that sound a lot like my grandfather would share. And Our Brother. Watching George Floyd's funeral, crying, thinking about his mama, smiling, watching brothers, Philonis and George, eating them sandwiches, banana and mayonnaise. Yes, that right. It was a family thing, like the feeling of dried clothes straight from the oven, warm, real family love. Ooh, and I go, ooh, because I'm done. And we have at least enough time for questions.
Thank you so much, Denise. Thank you.
That was fabulous, Denise.
Oh, thank you, y'all. I really appreciate it.
I'm just going to
I
shut my blinds because I'm getting a light in my eye.
see, but maybe it was from it's that feeling of warmth that we are getting from the words that we are feasting off of. Yeah, yeah. They're coming in. They're coming into your
That's
home.
right.
So now we've got this first question that's come up, and I think that I'm going to start with one that has a combo of Denise and Gabriel, and it said, "You're both at Monash Uni. Would you consider monitoring emerging writers who are not a part of the tertiary system? And then also, or is it important for us to have or to acquire some formal qualifications?" I hope I've read that right because I don't have my glasses on. Gabriel, did you want to touch on that? Maybe I can round robin it.
Yes, absolutely. I can only say I became an academic because my experience at university was phenomenal. I adored studying literature. It was difficult because I was an international student and I was paying for my own fees at the time. So it was a very onerous period in my life. But when I started studying literature at a tertiary education system, it was like someone opened the world to me, not only in terms of the options that were available, but the way I thought about the world. It was almost like books spoke to me, and I learned how to interpret the world through literature. So that was some of my most important professional skills came from that. So I would strongly urge anyone to study literature at university. I think it's phenomenal. If you want to write, that's the way to go. I've never thought about mentoring emerging writers who are not at uni, but that's something I would certainly consider. Yeah, it's a great new proposition. Sure.
And I just realized that in the looking through my lens here of my eyes, that I said, I think monitoring instead of mentoring. Thank you, Gabriel, for noting that. And look, I feel like teaching, and like my daughter would say, my youngest would say, my mommy teaches teachers to teach, and so mentoring is really a part of that, and so I would be quite happy to be involved in that. And I don't think that qualifications are necessarily required, but I think that they can give you a sense of tools for where to go next in many ways. We've got another one here. It's from me. Maybe I can answer it really quickly. As an early childhood educator, do you find that your writing informs how you teach in the classroom, or vice versa? Ooh, I think, Sandi, we touched on this the other day, didn't we? That what was it that you were saying before about the one, or maybe it was Gabriel.
As a librarian, my work bleeds into the writing, and the writing bleeds into being a librarian. And then writing about cystic fibrosis bleeds into being a volunteer. And it's just this big bundle of one. So I would say, yes, the writing has definitely influenced how I am as a librarian, and the books that I then introduce to the students.
Yes, yes. And it's the same for me. And I feel like yeah, the same for me in that regard. Gabriel, we've got a quick question for you as well.
Sure.
And they're saying, I'm trying to break, let me read it real quick. I am trying to break into having my manuscripts published for science sci-fi writing. Would you recommend any Australian publishers or agents, or do you publish overseas?
Well, first of all, can I say kudos to you, because not everyone gets their first manuscript written, so that's phenomenal, really good. I really struggled with getting published in Australia. I had to get published overseas, and part of that was that publishers wanted me to write about being gay and Mexican, and that's not what I write about. I don't know whether I will write about it at some point, but that's not what I write about at the moment. I write fiction, and I write fantasy and sci-fi, and so I really struggled with that, and I had to get published in the US first. So I'm afraid I wouldn't have any recommendations in Australia. I certainly have recommendations overseas, and more than happy to pass those on.
I think it's a much bigger market in the US for the science and the fantasy, which is why we often struggle with those genres here in Australia.
Mm. And I think just recently, I just saw a tweet from Maxine Beneba Clark that she retweeted that there is a call for Indigenous and Black writers to write or to submit something for speculative fiction. And I can't remember who it was, and because my brain's gone kaput on that sense. So, yep, Diged Press. Thank you very much, Ruby, for helping me. And just one more question, maybe. Hopefully we've gone just slightly 8 seconds over our time, but I'd love to be able to get this one in. And that is, what piece of advice would you give someone or wish you were told earlier on in your careers as writers? You know, what piece of advice do you wish you were told? Maybe in a sentence.
I think the biggest one for me would be, I submit too early. And I know a lot of writers say that is sit on it for 6 months, reread it, and then see if you still want to submit it. Just because the submission window's open doesn't mean your piece is ready to go in it.
And Gabriel?
I would say that's a tough one to come up with one, but I would say write every day. Early on, someone told me to write every day, and that is something that I enjoy tremendously. And I think writing is rewriting. So, you know, when you get into the habit of writing every day and then just editing, you're not as afraid of writer's block and things like that. So I think writing every day was a very good piece of advice for me.
And I think that mine would be that you can write, that it's not just a chosen few that can write, that you can write. And every time that I write a poem and share it, I still share it with other people and get their thoughts on it. And if they are moved, if I could see the feelings wiggling out, then I feel like I'm like, oh, okay, I'm doing what Audre Lorde said I could do, you know. And but I think that would be my take would be that you can do it, and that and share it. Well, I just want to give all of us a round of applause. We can't see all the folks that are out there, and but I love those questions and the thoughts, and I think team emerging at any stage, y'all, it was good. You feel good?
Very good. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Sandi and Denise. Thanks to the Emerging Writers Festival. Thank you so much for having us here. For the people watching, thank you for your questions and for your time. You know, the privilege of your attention. You could be watching cute puppies on TikTok, and here you are watching us. You know. If we were able to get someone's attention away from a cute puppy and they're looking at us, I think that's a good day. That's a good day's work, right?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Denise, for being such a wonderful host and coming up with some great questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, y'all. Really, well, it was all of us collectively, and I also would like to thank the Emerging Writers Festival, and gosh, it feels really good to be able to you know, to help with this panel and to just to light up, I think, the spaces in how we think of emerging at any stage. And I'd also like to pay a special thanks to Ruby. And oh, there's one more thing that I need to say really quickly, and that is that this is incredible art that you have engaged with or heard, and that making and that sharing of good art, that costs money. And on behalf, or rather on the Emerging Writers Festival's program, half of it is free, and they're committed to keeping those ticket prices low. And so that you, and to make sure that it's accessible, like now. I mean, you're at home and able to watch this. And so we want to make sure that that you know that it's especially important this year, especially with the COVID and the loss of work for artists and storytellers around the globe, that if you've enjoyed tonight's performance, that you consider maybe chunking some change at the Emerging Writers Festival. If 20 people, they shared, gave $5, just $5, it would pay for tonight's performers. And it's super easy to become an Emerging Writers Festival pen pal by donating to their website. And so that's just one little bit that we wanted to make sure that we shared. And I thank you so very much for the time. Gabriel, Ochoa, Sandi, Parsons, Denise, Chapman, thank you very much to the Emerging Writers Festival. And this was Emerging at Any Stage.
Thank you.